This is Writer Life, a podcast about writing, life, coffee and conversation with Rob and John Morgan.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Writer Life. I'd just like to say, the podcast has been going for a couple of months now and it's slowly growing. I don't have a huge following. I never really expected one. If you think about it, over the last few years, writing and reading especially has become kind of like a dwindling thing in the world today. Most of our young people today are not really that interested in books and would rather watch a film, a horror movie or an action film, or go online and play games and so forth. So to see that I've actually got a few little additions to the podcast and more people subscribing, even though it's only slow, I am incredibly grateful to those of you who have clicked on the subscribe button and have liked the videos. And as I'll always say, again, if you've got questions or you want to make a comment, then please feel free, go down there and into the little box and just write something. But I am incredibly grateful. I do try, because, I get it, this old guy banging on about his writing craft and so forth. It doesn't appeal to a very, very wide audience. And I was aware of that when I decided to start the podcast off. But, as I say, it is appreciated. And I do try to keep it as kind of interesting as possible and choose really unusual subjects, be them, like understood or controversial. And I like to pull these things apart and talk about them. So thank you for listening, and I hope you're going to enjoy it. Today I've got something a little bit different, as you can see by the title of the podcast, which is Hallowed Days. It is a time of great fun and joy, as families all over this planet over the next coming week are going to be celebrating the festivities of Halloween. Now, it's really interesting that in one of the most religious, puritanical countries of the developed Western world, Halloween, which celebrates witches, demons and all things dark, has actually become the second biggest celebration of the American year. It's actually only seconded because Christmas is bigger. Now, I have a bit of a fascination with history and also spiritual beliefs. And so at this time I find it really fascinating that when we look to the past history of what are known as the land of the Celts, which is now the United Kingdom, we've seen American consumerism take over pretty much all of the traditions of our own cultural heritage. And it's now, at this moment in time especially, the shops are dominated and swamped by Halloween goods. Now, I think if you ask anybody on the street, where does Halloween come from, they'll more than likely respond that it's an American tradition that dates back to the famous witch trials at Salem. It is true that the Puritans of that time, who were devout Christians, accused several of their village with congress with the devil and dancing naked in the woods. And as history has since proven, most of it was pretty much based around the hysteria of what was seen as a zealot and devout belief in Christian teachings, which was driven by fanatics who were hell-bent on maintaining control of the village of Salem. Now, I can't deny, I love things like this because it highlights the power struggles and also actually the misuse of a religion in order to create fear and control of a population into a certain way of being. I'd go so far as to say that to question Salem's leaders at that time is not so much an attack on the religion or the faith, but more on those who've manipulated that faith in order to exact control of the masses by using fear. I think Christianity has very, very many great messages of love and peace within it. I do believe it is a force for good, but as we've seen over the ages, there have been many occurrences where The religion has been used to manipulate the masses using bad actors, which to a degree, it has damaged the religion in the eyes of a great many. Christianity is not the only religion that's, has had its dark days. I do not believe there is any modern religion today that does not have blood on its hands from events of the past. But in modern culture today, there's no greater example of a religion that uses its zealots to inflict mass damage on another religion than that of the slaughter of the millions of pagans in the lands of the British Isles around the first few centuries AD. Their need to kill or convert the Celtic pagans when the Romans first invaded is probably one of their actual darkest times. And I'm not even going to go into what happened in Africa or even to the indigenous peoples of America. I find it really sad, because when you actually look back into Christian belief and you actually look at the start of Christianity, a lot of Christians were murdered and slaughtered because of their belief system. And so for them to come to another land and do the same somehow doesn't really balance with me. I just don't think that equates properly. And I don't know how the Christians could come to terms with that. It's actually one of the reasons that I've always been fascinated with Halloween, because in many ways, as we see it today, it has swept the planet, pushed by massive American corporations, and it has actually become a global phenomenon. And it is actually worth approximately $6 billion a year. And that alone, literally, is just the American spending. It really fascinates me, because it's actually the biggest cultural contradiction on the planet today. You see, Halloween, as much as the sort of Americans love to say it's theirs, I would actually argue it's actually based in Celtic pagan culture. At the heart of its origins, it's definitely Celtic, and the rituals and rites of the pagan past were around a good 1,000 years before Christianity was even born. So, as you can see, to celebrate Halloween is actually to celebrate paganism in a country that is devoutly Christian and very puritanical. Let me elaborate, because as a writer I've looked to the cultural pagan past, and I've used it actually a great deal in quite a lot of the stories that I've written, especially in the Countess of Darkness, where Morgana undertakes a ritual to mark her as the coming queen of a ritual tribe of pagan worshippers. Now I'm going to add at this point that, to write this part of the book, I took the basic ingredients of some pagan ritual and then I elaborated them, and I moulded the narrative by adding fantasy fiction to enhance this part so that it actually fitted into the narrative of the book better, because this was Morgana's story and I needed to emphasize how important she was going to become. Unsure if the trembles were nerves or the cold, she tried to stand still, understanding her mother must have done this at some point in her early life. Knowing that helped, because her mother was still here, so she knew she would live. What happened next almost paralyzed her. The clips on her dress were released by a handmaiden, and her dress fell down to the floor, leaving her stood completely naked, with over 200 people looking at her. Her reaction was natural. She gasped out in surprise, and realizing she was nude, she moved her hands to cover herself, feeling shamed. Her mother spoke calmly and quietly. "Do not hide yourself. You've nothing to feel shame for. You will be anointed and purified in what is a sacred act. Morgana, we're all creatures of the natural world." It was easy for her mothers to say. She was not naked and being stared at as her face burned red with embarrassment. The priest turned and began to speak, and did not even look at her body. He talked quickly, and held a bowl into which he dipped his finger, which contained a blue-coloured paste. He lifted his hand with the finger, drew a line across her forehead and then on her cheeks, nodded, and turned back round to the stone altar. He lifted his arms and spoke words loudly, and all of the others replied in almost like a chanting prayer. Morgana faced forward, terrified of looking at anyone while stood naked in front of them. She felt humiliated and really frightened for the first time in a very long time. The druid turned, looked her in the eyes, and he said something she did not understand. Her mother leaned in. "Morgana, kneel." Her legs were shaking so much she was sure she could not but unlock them, and slowly descended. In many ways it helped, as she felt it did hide her womanhood a little. She looked up at the man, who gave a nod to her and then dipped his hand in a small bowl as he spoke in a very fast language. He touched her head, the sides of her face, and above her eyes with what she thought was some form of fragrant water. The large circle of people all started to speak in unison. She had no idea what they were saying, but it felt like some sort of prayer. She knew nothing of what was happening. All her mother had said was it was important, so she'd agreed to go along with it. Although, if she'd have known it meant being stripped naked before 200 men, she never would have come. The priest raised his arms and spoke loudly, and suddenly the beat of the drums began. They started slowly as the priest turned, holding what looked like a wine jug. He looked down at her and spoke as he waved it above her head, and the drums started to beat faster. And as they did, all of the watchers joined in, stamping their feet on the ground. The rhythm got faster and faster, and the crowd started to chant. The priest looked down and lowered the jug. It was clear he wanted her to take a drink. The rhythm was getting faster and faster as the drums beat and the feet stamped and the crowd chanted. None of this made any sense to her, as she did not understand a word that they were saying. She could no longer see her mother, who was now knelt behind her, and the jug lowered as the beat echoed with chants, and suddenly it was at her lips. She could smell the strong alcohol smell as the jug tipped, and she leaned in, opened her mouth, and the liquid passed her lips and burned into her mouth, catching her breath. Morgana almost choked as the jug tipped in more, and she pulled back her head and had no choice but to swallow. It burned into her throat as she coughed, and the beat was faster than ever, and as she tried to recover her senses and breathe in, the priest spoke. She looked up, and his palms came down and pressed onto her face, then slid. His hands had some form of liquid on them, and he smeared it down her face, neck, and down over her breasts towards her stomach. She flinched with shock as he touched her breasts, and then felt him push onto her stomach, and she gasped with complete surprised shock. Morgana looked down and saw the glistening red on her breasts, and realized. Her eyes opened wide as she looked up as she spoke. "Is that blood?" He leaned into her, lifted a small round pot saucer, and powder hit her square in the face as she recoiled back in total shock as the powder drove at deep speed into her eyes. There was a blinding flash behind her eyes, and Morgana recoiled backwards, and her mother caught her by the shoulders and lowered her slowly to the floor. Morgana was blinded and utterly terrified as the drums suddenly ceased and all fell quiet. In her head, all she could hear was her pounding heart and her breath as it rushed into her mouth at speed and then flowed back out. Her mind was filled with flashes as she twitched and jerked on the floor, and inside her head pictures started to form. She had no idea what had happened. Somehow, she was locked inside her own mind. Everything on the outside world had been shut out and closed off as Morgana's mind took full control. In the wide circle, the robes had been flung off to loud cheers, and everyone was dancing around the circle, chanting and singing, whilst on the floor, the naked Morgana twitched and jerked, her legs wide open, her arms spread out wide, as in her head she wrestled with the truth of who she really was. A wooden low bed on legs was carried in, and gently the handmaidens picked her up and laid her on the soft sheets as she writhed and jerked, out of control and afflicted with spasms. Behind the table of stone, bonfires ignited as the people danced naked towards it, and the bed was lifted by 6 happily chanting naked men, and Morgana was carried towards the fire, where they lifted her up and danced around the large roaring flames, cheering and singing, the red glow of the heat lighting up Morgana's white, naked, glistening skin. Round and round the fire they danced. It paints quite a picture of what is a celebration of people dancing naked around a fire. And, for someone who was within a Puritan culture, this would indeed appear to be pretty shocking. The truth is, this sort of ritual or celebration was actually quite commonplace in all of the lands at one time. It was seen as a natural way to celebrate, which was with food, wine, fire, and nudity, all of which are absolute natural parts of life, as was the medicines of that time. All of it was based on plants and herbs, some of which are still used in medicine today. The church attacked this and named those who took part in it witches and worshippers of the devil. I think, to be honest, if you look at humanity as a whole and you look at the world today, I think there's bad actors in just about every single aspect of life, and the same goes for religion. There's just people who are just genuinely horrible, nasty people who want power and control and do really, really shitty and horrible things to people. Because in truth, most witches are actually good people. They're nature-loving and spiritual, but have been painted far darker and corrupt than they ever were. Possibly because, whereas the Puritan communities had values of prudishness, witches were pretty happy to accept their bodies and run naked and free within nature. There was actually a time in this world, long before the modern media and social media, dating back thousands of years, where nudity wasn't shamed. Nudity was actually an acceptable part of normal life. Just look at the communal naked Roman baths of Turkey today, or the onsens in Japan, where it's quite normal to have segregated women's and males areas, but there's also communal mixed sex areas. Somehow with the modern world, nudity has become some sort of ingredient for sexualized behavior. Every single aspect of nudity, as I've written and spoken about in other podcasts, has been sexualized. And maybe this stems back to some of these values of prudishness that date back to the 1600s. In one sense, much like today, nudity at the time, was sexualized, and the greatest fear of the Puritans, I think, was that the witches or the naked pagans really, they would tempt the men into sexual misconduct, which in their eyes was very, very sinful. Sexually liberated and body-positive people at that time were seen as shameful and sinful, and they were named as demons, harlots, and outcasts. It appears actually, when you think about it, very little has changed over the years. Because I know a lot of naturists, and naturists today, to a degree, they're still viewed the very same way by some. Now, knowing that, it's easy to see how the evil and dangerous tags were applied to what were basically simple women, which, like the word pagan, were used as slurs in the past, and these were names given to pagans as it traditionally meant uneducated heathen, which is how pagans were seen by the Christian Romans. Witch was also a term used initially to describe the women of pagan tribes who dealt with herb lore. The Christians believed at that time that life was in the hands of God alone, and so to meddle in it was a practice of the devil. That's a way of thinking that actually saw millions of women in the 1600s slaughtered and burned during the infamous witch trials of that time. It did not make matters any better that traditionally in pagan culture, the healers were usually paid with offerings such as food, alcohol, or sex. Because, most money at that time didn't exist. We lived in a system of bartering. Halloween is about far more than that, because unbeknown to most people, its roots are centred firmly in the traditions of the pagan past of the United Kingdom. Now, I love history, I love folklore, and I love mythology. And I thought it would be quite nice to travel back in this particular episode and take a really good look at the roots of our pagan past and see how much of it is actually still in our culture today. Because without realising it, there's actually still a very, very strong connection to naked, natural pagan life. In order to understand the traditions of what was pagan life before the Christian church came to our shores and almost wiped out paganism, you need to understand that the year back then was actually centred around the growing cycle of a year. It had nothing to do with days and months. That actually came with the Romans. As human beings, we naturally adapted our life around all of the tasks which involved ensuring the survival of a tribe. The calendar back then was known as the Wheel of Life, and so it was divided into seasons that prioritised certain tasks that had to be done, because the survival of the tribe was the main concern of everybody. Everyone back then lived as one big community. Everybody knew each other. It was impossible to meet a stranger in day-to-day living, because the tribes were so closely bonded and focused on the work to maintain the encampment and defences. Because if you think about it, it was hostile at times, because tribes did fight. And of course, everybody joined in with all of the communal celebrations. In today's world, it's probably harder to understand life at that time, because especially since the Industrial Revolution, when the rise of modern media, we've had a lot of control inflicted on what was a natural narrative of the pagan past, and we've been kind of moved away from believing the same kinds of things. Again, the Christian church is, considered to be the cornerstone of modern democracy. And for a very, very long time, whether you love it or hate it, the Christian church was actually a really oppressive thing. Marriage back then was nothing like it actually is today. Back then it was something done only by the rich. It was an actual business arrangement. It was nothing to do with one true loves or falling deeply romantically in love with someone. It was cut and dried. It was cold. It was a business arrangement that dealt with titles and land. And so a man entered into a legally binding contract with a female to ensure her faithfulness until she produced a male heir that was of his bloodline. What most institutions forget to inform us all of is, that actually, once an heir was produced, the male and female lived quite separate lives back then and would often sleep and have sex with quite a few others. Now, the pagan Celtic tribes were actually really liberated people. They were very cultured, far more cultured than they'd been given any credit for. They had sexual equality. A male or female could lead the tribe. And they were not monogamous people. They had several lovers at any given time. Now, as stated earlier, everyone knew everybody else, so it was actually impossible back in those days to sleep with a stranger. They were, to a degree, polyamorous. Now, as you can possibly understand, the new incoming Roman Christians, who were all about order and control, they had to find a way to break the spirit of the pagan tribes, and so that they could, to a degree, convert them. And so death or conversion became their means of taming what they saw as an uncultured heathen race. They really had no understanding of what was actually a very rich culture that believed in a natural way of life, and that was reflected in all of their life and all of their culture. It's not really that unsimilar to how the Wiccan and Druid circles work today. Their lives involve nudity and the close bonds that unite them as they celebrate and revive aspects of the traditional spiritual practices of the times before the crucifix came to our shores. There's a great deal of study and research that's undertaken by serious covens to learn the past culture of all of the lands, and all of them play a role in this rich tapestry of modern life linked with the ancients. It's normal, if not expected, for a devout follower of these spiritual traditions to purify themselves in a washing ritual, where they will adorn only a robe before entering the edges of a sacred space, which is based on the past traditions of our line. Before the ritual can begin, the robe is dropped and the participants step naked or skyclad into the circle as a purified representation of the human being, and then they conduct the ritual. Now, it's been this way for thousands of years, but in more recent times, and especially with the rise of Wiccan and its flourishing popularity across the prudish United States of America, many young new entrants into Wicca refuse to practice naked out of embarrassment and shame. I think it is actually really sad that a tradition as old as man is so easily being corrupted by what is the fault of a modern media narrative that shames the human form. And we cannot help but wonder if these people are really serious or actually even understand the purity of our ancient past and its rituals. It is such a shame that young people today are so easily manipulated, and that something as old as man has no power to show them the right way to live a natural life. Earlier this year, my family and I attended what was named Lammas Camp. We were actually really delighted to see the camp named such because on the first week of August, as was traditional pagan culture, the first wheat was cut and tested. It was ground down into flour and bread was baked, and it began a celebration of what was the first new loaf of the year, loaf mass, or Lammas in pagan culture. The bread would be served to all of the tribe, who prepared for long days of cutting and storing of the wheat, and a celebration of feasting and dancing naked in the sun was had by all. People would weave corn dollies out of the first sheaves to adorn their houses, and it was seen as a good omen and protection to keep the sun high and dry out all of the fields and the crops and scare the bad spirits away until all of the wheat was ripe and dried out. Lammas is important because it marks the beginning of the end, as the days roll towards what is the end of the growing year, where all of the food is harvested through the last summer days, early September and into October, and then it is sent into storage, ready for the long winter to come. It can be hot, sweaty, naked work, but as a community, everybody spent long days of preparation, picking apples, collecting fruit berries, making jams, pickling plants, drying herbs, and storing the grain. Hunters would spend more time out in the wilds, stalking animals, and their kills would be a blessing as the meat was prepared and stored in vats of salt to serve the need of the tribe through the long days of darkness, as the days of light were starting to shorten. Now soon it's going to be Halloween, or as the pagans know it, Samhain, which is actually pronounced in two ways depending on your dialect. It can either be pronounced as Soin or Sohun. When translated into the modern language, it becomes summer's end. The power of this time of year was such that when Christians arrived on the shores, they actually found it really hard to combat it. And so what they did was they adapted their celebration into their own faith to make it far more accessible to converting pagans. And they named this special night All Hallows Eve. So what is it exactly? Samain actually serves, or Samhain, serves two purposes, right? The first and the most important is that it is actually the pagan New Year. October 31st marks the end of the season of life, and it is the end of the growing year. All the main work has been done, the food is stored, and all of the houses and fences have been maintained to ensure their integrity throughout the season of wind, rain and snow. Now with luck, the days are still quite mild, and there is still a stockpile of food as all of the storage areas are full. And so just like today, a huge celebration was thrown where all of the tribe gathered to gorge on food, wine and dance naked around the fire. The coming months were going to be hard, so pagans would fatten themselves up to ensure that their bodies had enough to see them through what for them was a very bleak time. It was a huge celebration, not unlike actually our own New Year's celebrations. Bodies were painted with the symbols of life and death to scare away all of the bad spirits, usually using woad. It is a kind of a blue colour that attracts the eyes of the spirits of our ancestors, and it draws them to us as they are invited into the thin places to celebrate with them. Now, the second most important thing around this time for our pagan families of the past is the acknowledgement of our ancestors. Now, at this time, it was once believed that the veil between the two worlds of life and death thinned, so that we could commune with those who walked before us. Pagans did not believe in death. They believed that the spirits of those before us remained always with us. So it was really important at that time to welcome them back into the tribe to share the joy of surviving another year. You know, it really is very important to understand that in our spirit form, we are as we are in life. So we are our natural bodily shape. In essence, we take our true and natural naked form, which is why there's so much dancing naked with our bodies painted. In our naked form, painted with the symbols of life and death, we were the living embodiment of our spiritual ancestors, who could then see us and recognize us. If you think about it, as we sit here today, we're all aware that soon the darkness is going to be upon us. And so if you think about it, the lighting of fires was symbolic of celebrating the last light of the year. And it brought with it protections of the flame, so it could keep us safe and scare away any unwanted bad spirits. The keepers of our religious and spiritual rites in the UK at that time were the Druids, who would preside over these great celebrations to ensure the safe passage of the spirits into our world were met. It was a time of great spiritual significance, as the days of October the 31st and November the 1st marked the time of the meeting of souls. Now, in many pagan songs and rhymes, this time of year is usually referred to as Old Souls' Night, which maybe played a big influence in the naming of the Christian festival of All Souls' Night or All Hallows' Eve. The Christian service of All Hallows is one of remembering the dead, and it is very, very similar in its structure, apart from the fact that, the nudity was removed. Puritans didn't want to show their bodies, that was shameful. In many ways, the similarities between this one Christian and pagan festival really do show at this time of year. And to a degree, it is one part of our ancient tradition that, in an odd sort of way, because the Roman Christians were pretty ruthless in their slaughter of pagans, it helps to keep what is an ancient rite that actually goes back thousands of years to a time of ancient Celtic Britain alive. Now maybe there's an irony here, because in a bid to remove pagan worship, the Christians have actually helped to keep it alive in modern society. I think that's a pretty interesting fact. Keeping safe through the dark time was very, very important to the spiritual beliefs of that time. And another way of doing that, which has survived thanks to our American cousins, because most of those in the US are based actually in the same past cultural history as we are, because they left the shores of the British Isles to go and colonize the Americas. The thing that has survived is their tradition of carving pumpkins to scare away the evil, which again are illuminated by fire, which is a massively symbolic aspect of Samhain. Pumpkins did not grow in Britain at that time, but the Celts of Ireland, which you have to understand is the spiritual centre of Celticism, did something very similar, which we think was probably the main influence behind pumpkin carving in the United States, because it's actually a very little known fact, but it was actually the Irish who travelled to the new lands with their ancient Celtic traditions that actually became the founders of what in the Americas today is seen as Halloween. The USA has many pagan traditions which were brought from our shores to those of the Americas. The Irish began the practice of carving turnips, which I believe in America are known as rutabaga. Now, clearly there were not that many available at the time, and so they used what was in bountiful supply. And it is believed that, as an alternative, the Irish living in Northern Americas started to carve pumpkins instead. I mean, after all, a scary face lit by fire was the aim of the game to keep the bad spirits at bay, allowing only the good spirits to pass on into the celebrations. There really are many other traditions that have become associated over time, one of which actually is the tradition of bobbing apples. Now, I'm not sure if people around the world would know of this, but the way it works is apples are placed into a barrel of water to float, and then participants place their hands behind their backs, and they try to grab an apple with their mouth. I mean, it's something that I did as a kid. It was great fun. It really is a lot of fun to try it, especially with a group of half-drunk adults. And I really would recommend that if you've never done it, this Halloween, give it a try. You'll find it's an amazing fun. Now, this game, which many children over the years in the UK have played, is based on the traditions of the myth of Avalon, or as we know it today, Glastonbury. It's now been proven that during the autumn months of the Dark Ages, Glastonbury would actually flood. But Glastonbury, which was renowned at that time for many things, one of which was actually the burial site of the great Celtic King Arthur, it was also known for having some of the finest apples in the area. Now, there's no coincidence that Glastonbury is in Somerset, which is actually a world leader for growing many delicious varieties of apple. That the whole region of Somerset is probably, it's the heart of cider making country in Great Britain, and Great Britain actually grows hundreds of different varieties of really wonderful apples, of which Glastonbury is right in the heart of it. So if you think about it, the water became too deep to wade through to collect all of these apples, which would fall from the trees and they would float on the surface of the water. And so what would happen is people would use boats, which at the time were called coracles, And this was kind of like a round, lightweight boat, and it was not the most stable, and it took great skill to use it. It required both arms to paddle and stabilize it. So the people would sit in their boats and lean forward, grip the apples with their teeth, and then sit back, dropping the apple into the coracle to collect them. Now this, would normally kind of occurred around late September to the middle of October, but over time it's become linked with Samhain in all of our traditional celebrations. So what of trick-or-treating? Well, trick-or-treating is based in the ancient Irish pagan tradition known as souling. It is believed that the Irish who went to America continued to embrace most of their traditional past, much to the disapproval of the Puritans. Souling is actually where poor people went from door to door, visiting families and friends and praying with them for the souls of each of their families dead. Now, in return for this, they would be given a small cake. Over the years, the traditional custom has evolved and spread, taking on a more modern twist, and the cakes have been replaced with sweets. The tradition of trick-or-treating is still a little bit hazy and blurred, like quite a lot of some of the traditions from paganism. Maybe they've been lost forever. All Souls Day is more of a kind of medieval British thing, which again it's based on the idea of souling, but it was adapted mainly by the poor to beg to the rich. On the 2nd of November every year, the poor and the needy would send out their children to beg the rich people for what became known as soul cakes. Now these were like small little cakes that were mainly made from sweetened bread, and those of the rich that felt really sorry for the children who were hungry would hand these out. The children would collect them in small cloth bags and then take them home to feed their families. So in many ways it is the British equivalent of the US tradition of giving treats, and it's generally thought that this was adapted into the customs of the Irish when they went to America. Guising was another medieval practice, which again is very, very similar, and again it's based in pagan tradition, but it's been adapted. Young people would dress up and go around collecting food, wine and money to help keep their poor families going through the harsh winters. Now the children would pay those who gave them things by singing or reciting popular poems. The tricking aspect is a little unclear, although it is kind of rumoured and believed that those who did not give got a fright or a trick played on them in the weeks that followed the celebration. And so trick-or-treating really actually started out as a British-based tradition steeped heavily in pagan culture. I'd like to add that, before health and safety regulations came along and killed the event, in the UK on the 5th of November, we had the tradition of bonfire night. That also experienced something very similar, which was that children would make a stuffed image of Guy Fawkes, who was famous for attempting to burn down Parliament. They would carry this guy around shouting, "Penny for the guy," and people would hand them pennies. Now, it's very, very similar to that of guising, and it would start 2 weeks prior to November the 5th. So actually, if you think about it, it does fit very nicely into the past pagan tradition, and maybe, penny for the guy again is another example of an old custom being adapted into modern life. Now, as much as the USA is predominantly known for trick-or-treating at Halloween, it actually has only really been since around the 1950s that the tradition has actually expanded and exploded within American culture. It was initially started as a form of hijinks, that some of it got spliced very nicely with the traditions of the past, and it has now grown into what has become the second largest holiday of the American year. And it really is so interesting. This stuff fascinates me, that all of the traditions of the ancient past have come together to be kind of the modern custom that we now see today. Every year, billions of dollars are spent on Halloween, and it is seconded only by the spending at Christmas, as an American culture has swept the world, and it has become a worldwide phenomenon. Now, regardless of its American status, it really is based deeply in a culture that dates back thousands of years from the traditions of the pagans, and it should be in earnest the celebration of food, fire, and nudity, as we all come together to celebrate life at its most glorious, natural best, and show gratitude via our spiritual connection with those who walked this land long before us. It's important to recognise they are the reason that today we're all here celebrating in the many different ways of praise that we actually do. In the spirit of that tradition, my own family will carve and light pumpkins and place them out in the garden, and we'll gather with friends and we'll celebrate with food and the giving of treats. And maybe we should all go one step further. Maybe, we should all get a little bit daring, probably have a few drinks first, and cast our inhibitions aside and all run outdoors and dance naked around the bonfire. I mean, I very much doubt few would, but I'm sure it would do everybody a great deal of good. It's strange to me that over the next 7 days we will see a direct clash between what Christianity sees as satanic, although I will add here that Satan was actually a Christian deity created by them and not the pagans, because the pagans have no idea of who Satan is and have no use for such beliefs. But it does strike me as odd that two directly contrasting beliefs can actually exist side by side in peace. It is a real shame, especially these days, as we look east and see all the death and the pain that is happening in the land of Israel and Palestine, where two equally contrasting beliefs are destroying each other. Now, as a writer, I feel it's really important to highlight all aspects of life, and that does include religious life. I've never shied away from showing the good, the bad, and the ugly of both Christian and pagan beliefs within the stories that I write. I mean, after all, as a writer, I'm at the heart and I'm the observer, and that is one of the most important elements of actually writing. So, if you're carving pumpkins, or you're dressing up, or even dancing naked around a fire, I actually hope all of you have a really, really wonderful time. Feast well, and enjoy the company of good people in safety and in peace. So I wish you all Semaine blessings and happy Halloween. I cannot deny I had a huge amount of fun putting this particular episode together, because it kind of plays into my geeky history, mythology kind of aspect of who I am. If you sat and listened through all of this, and if you've learned something from this that has enhanced your own celebrations of Halloween, then I'm absolutely delighted, and I thank you very, very much for listening in and sitting around while I rattle off my sort of geeky side of paganism and history of the British Isles. I'll be back next week with something I hope equally as interesting. I'm always looking for ways to kind of add some fun as well as some interesting facts, and so I'll put together something else which I hope you'll all enjoy. Again, as I said at the start of this podcast, I really do appreciate all of you who've subscribed. I know you're not a huge group, but honestly, I am so delighted to have you all here and to have you all listening. So thank you very much. If you can like the video or comment on the video, that would be massively helpful. So I'll be back next week with something really, really different and unusual. And so for now, I will say goodbye and enjoy your spooky and creepy weekend.
Thanks for listening to the Writer Life podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, or there are areas of Robin's stories you would like him to discuss, please add your thoughts and questions in the comments, and we will include them in a future episode. You can follow Robin on all his social media links, which you will find listed below, and please, like and subscribe to this channel, so you get the latest notifications when he posts. All Robin's books are available in digital and print formats to purchase or download through all online book sales sites.